Hentle, Danse, Anin, Y. Welcome, everybody, to High Tanning for Wellness. This panel is hosted by Culture Bites, an ongoing project by the Indigenous Youth Wellness Team, which is a part of the BC Provincial Health Services Authority. The IYW team's mission is to connect Indigenous youth to their culture and identity with innovative programming rooted in ancestral values. Today, we'll be discussing the ways that practicing high tanning has contributed to our wellness. We'll start by talking physical and mental wellness, go to emotional and spiritual aspects, and finish by discussing tanning's role in community wellness. Our goal for this gathering is to have everyone come away inspired with a new perspective or way to articulate the ways that high tanning or any traditional practice that we engage in positively impacts our health and well-being. The panel is going to go for an hour. I'll be keeping 10 to 15 minutes near the end just to answer any questions from our audience. And just to make sure everyone's aware, the panel is being recorded. And finally, there will be a survey link in the follow-up email to this panel. If everyone could take some time to fill it out, we'd really appreciate it. There's just a few demographic questions and some questions that are related to the programming IYW offers. Anything that we get back will go a long way in ensuring that the programming we offer will be valuable to the communities we serve. So thanks for bearing with me through that bit of housekeeping. And with that out of the way, I'm super, super excited to get started. I think it'd be great to start with a round of introductions, and I can start it off. So, Gas Gehalt, Jacob Knutson is Squish, Kintel Sochtamo, Ush Apana, Isinalitin, Nlaka'pamux. Good afternoon, everyone, or evening for some of our panelists. I think, maybe, I don't know. My name's Jacob Knutson. I'm the graphics and production specialist with the IYW team and your moderator for today's panel. My dad's from Denmark, and my mom is Syilx and Stalo by my late grandpa and Métis by my grandma. I'm joining you from so-called Merritt, BC in Nlaka'pamux and Syilx territory. And maybe let's go around the horn here with just a round of introductions. If maybe Teresa, do you want to start us off?
Hi, Hankla, Teresa Thomas, Tushla, Cooks Ferry Kin. Hello, my name is Teresa Thomas. I grew up in Cooks Ferry, one of the Nlaka'pamux nations, or the bands. And I was raised in Cooks Ferry, but I'm from Invermere, which is in Secwepemc territory. And my roots there are Kimbaski. And I'm joining in also from Merritt. I am the Shubla coordinator at Chief Nlaka'pamux Assembly, which means I am the women's coordinator. I'm happy to be joining you.
Okay, bonjour. My name is Kanina. Nice to meet you, Teresa. Your last name is, they didn't error with Teresa's last name. It's the same as mine. But my dad's name is Thomas Terry. So I just think that's funny. I was excited to see that there might be another half-breed Terry here. So my name is Kanina. I'm Ojibway half-breed. I grew up and born and raised in Syilx, Ontario, which is Treaty 3 Ojibway territory. And I've been high tanning for almost 8 years now, 7.5 years. And I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for the invite.
Awesome. We're super happy to have you here as well. And Hayley?
Tanse usasko tausko nesegasan Peguis Virginia na miwitana opamitana kakyo na waganaka kwakana spomitana kakyo. Hello, my name's Hayley Bird-Matheson. My mom's family is the Bird family from Peguis First Nation. Our original reserve was called the St. Peter's Indian Reserve, which is in Selkirk, Manitoba, which is like 20 minutes away from Winnipeg. So that's my traditional territory on my mom's side, and my dad is mostly Scottish and French. I'm calling in from my traditional territory here in Winnipeg, so Treaty 1 territory. And I'm very much a beginner, still someone that's learning high tanning. But I think that's been important to connecting to other youth that are still learning too. So I'm really glad to be here with all of you. That's it.
BYTES Syilx squeezed Wacho Kinsukana nach Nlaka'pamux nach Nicola Tuli in Eismelch nach Spachamin. So my name is Wacho. I'm Okanagan, Thompson, and Cree. From Merritt originally, the so-called place that is Merritt, but I'm from the Upper Nicola part of the community. My roots there we are Lindleys. We are also on my grandmother's side. My late grandmother, we are Allisons, Edwards, Louise. On my Inla'u side, we're Shuttleworths. We are also in our Nlaka'pamux side, we're Garcias. And then my dad's late mother, was from Mistawasis in Saskatchewan. So actually we are related to the birds and the dreevers and the wolves and the ahenicus. And so all these relatives. I live in the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. That's actually where I do a lot of my work on hides, is in my backyard there. But I'm from the valley here. And I'm really happy to be joining the panel today to talk about my grandmother. Why?
Right on. Just revealing how Allan is connecting all of us. Yeah. Right on. So I think now that we're a bit more familiar with each other, it'd be really awesome to kind of get into how each of us found our way to tanning. I think if Teresa, if you wouldn't mind starting us off with that part of our panel today, that would be really awesome. I know you've got a really, really cool background, and I'm really excited to hear you talk about it.
So I kind of didn't really grow up in a world that didn't have hide tanning or like hides in it. My dad was a drum maker, so right off the bat, from when I was born, there's just drums everywhere. That's actually when he first started making drums, is like just before I was born. So that's when he found his love for working with the materials and everything. And he did about 10 drums, and then he fell in love. And then right after that, it was just like, that's all I remember him doing. Like, he would talk about his time working with SNTC or doing forestry work, but because I never seen it, it was so far in his history that I never fully believed that it was something he did, because I'm like, okay, you did that, but like it's always just been there. So my earliest memory is like being really little, and we're working outside and it's really hot, and I just wanted to go inside, but we're working on hides and they're teaching me like the importance of doing this. And so the way they would involve me was they would give me a spoon and they would get me to help, and they're like, "Here, baby, like come help." And I'm like, "Okay." And thinking I'm helping, and like maybe 3 years old, and then I would get kind of tired of like poking away, and I'm like, I don't understand what I'm doing. But every time I put the spoon down, I would get in trouble. So I would just carry around the spoon because I knew it was so important. And I just kept, yeah. But he did drums, he did stick games, he was doing a deep dive into the history of stick gaming and the differences between each nation. And he did a lot of like workshops on how to play stick games, why we played stick games, the different songs. He has a collection of binders, or a binder collection of songs that he was compiling. And it's been a big part of me. So I always love seeing people fall in love with doing the craft and like making time for it and seeing the importance behind it.
Why, that's awesome. Sweet. Yeah, maybe if anybody else wants to pick up where Teresa left off, that would be wicked. Maybe Allan? I think, yeah.
Yeah. So my late grandmother is Syilx Lottie Lindley, and she is from the Upper Nicola band. And her grandmother was actually from Chipaka area. And so it was this long line of matriarchs and women and femmes are where I get most of my knowledge from. And my grandmother, it was just a part of what the people did, right? My grandpa would hunt a deer. My grandmother would dress the hides and fix them, and she was quite an accomplished maker of things: gloves, moccasins, vests. She would make I don't know what the cassocks, the robes for priests in the community, and like book covers and stuff. And so it was just. Not only was it a means of income for supplementing her family during like the 60s, 70s, 80s and beyond, but it was also a deep practice for her. She got a lot of peace. And it was such a space of connection for us, like her grandchildren, those of us that had the opportunity to sit with her and to watch and participate when her and my aunties would all get together and tan hides in the little gully behind her house, right? That's a little bit of where I got my start from it. But again, as with Teresa, it's always been something that's been there in the family, and a part of our identity as Syilx people.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing, Allan. And then maybe Kanina, if you would want to take out from there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, like I said in the introduction, is I've been high tanning for about 8 years, and it's something that I had to seek out, and I didn't really know I wanted at the time. It was really just I saw a post on Facebook for a deer high tanning workshop in Thunder Bay, and that was a 4-hour drive for me, and I was able to attend. So I brought my son with me, and we spent 4 days working on a deer hide. He would have been 6.5. Yeah, not quite 7 at that time. And it just grabbed me like really hard. Like it was something I really haven't stopped doing since then. And I started just kind of, I think I tanned a deer hide a year for a while, while also just trying to figure out moose hide tanning, because moose is what my family hunts. And I think it took me 4 years to tan a moose hide after I started that deer hide workshop. And where I live, and to the north of me, if you can think of the map of Ontario, it's this big, vast area. And in those communities, we've had people up until maybe 20 years ago actively working on hides, maybe 30 years ago for some communities, but it just really stopped. And so I grew up smelling smoked hide. I knew that smell from wearing moccasins and mitts and hats made from smoked hide, but it just kind of stopped happening. Everything else, it just slowly became that orange commercially tanned leather, right? So when that workshop came about, I just knew I wanted to do it. And then through hide tanning, I found that my grandmother was a hide tanner, and that was something my mother didn't know, because my mom spent majority of her childhood in boarding home residential schools, and I always knew my grandfather would have worked on hides, but I think he did more of the raw hide work. So that's been really nice to know that, and to feels like I'm doing something that was really only one generation removed from my family, and now my kid and my nibblings all see this as well. And so, Teresa, when you were saying, that's something that was always there, I thought, this is what my son will know, right? His memories of being 6.5, he doesn't know that the pre-hide me. He has very little memories of that, so he just knows that this is something that I do. And now this is something that he's just expressed interest in tanning his first hide with me. So we're going to be working on a caribou hide this year, where it's something I've had him help me whenever I can, or whenever he's around and he's able to help. I'll put him to work, but he's never expressed interest in wanting to work on it, really. So I'm very excited to be doing that with him now. Miigwech.
Miigwech, that's awesome. That's so cool to hear. And then maybe we'll we'll finish this section with Hayley.
Yeah, I really, I think my family had they were quite removed from any type of like smoking of hide or like bringing it all the way to leather, just because of where our community was. The fur trade here was so prevalent, I guess. And then I have an auntie, my mom's sister, and she kind of was the first one in our family to start making moccasins again, to start making drums again, start making sequins and like rattles and things like that. And I feel guilty now because I know how much work all those things are, and how much love and attention and effort she put into those things. And me, I would just be like, "Can I have a new pair of moccasins?" or like whatever, and she would do it. She always would do it. And now that I'm starting to learn those things, I really, I'm starting to appreciate how much love and energy and time she put into those things. And um, my grandpa still hunted until he passed, and so she was the first one that started working with those, mostly just to the point of hide, like rawhide for drums and rattles. And then here in Winnipeg, for me, like Kanina was sharing, I kind of went to a workshop similar to that, and it was some like Métis women that run a group here called Red River Echoes, and they just do some work on kind of like Métis resistance and community building here in Winnipeg. And they had a moose hide that they set up for community to come in and learn how to scrape. And that was the first time I ever did that. And I was really emotional as soon as I like stepped into that space. And that experience, even thinking about it now, like makes me very emotional, because I think I had like a very visceral reaction to doing that, and a desire to continue to do that. So from that point, I'm lucky to have uncles that still hunt around here. And I think at the time I regretted sharing with them how much I liked it, because they started just piling up like bags of of their deers and their elks mostly that they were hunting, and they said like you wanted this, here they are. And so that's kind of where that process began. And so yeah, I've been kind of learning as I go, but also knowing that there is like a family responsibility I feel there as well. Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Awesome. Yeah, that's there's a lot there. I mean, shout out Red River Echoes. Those guys are really awesome. I follow what their projects and that. And as an uncle that happens to have smoked hides around, whenever I've got like a niece, nephew, or nibbling that asks for some new moccasins or whatever, I get really excited. So don't feel bad. Just always super, super hyped to share. I think it's really powerful to hear everybody's stories about kind of finding tanning, or the way that it is a part of our lives. And I think that hearing, especially I really resonate with Hayley and Kanina, your stories quite a bit, because Allan is my relative, which is my mom didn't grow up. We didn't grow up around a lot of our extended family, and like Kanina's, hide tanning was something that I found myself seeking out later on in my life. And when I was able to learn and begin to practice that with following a move up to my family's territory, or where we made our home, it was just like Hayley described, it was a very emotional experience to kind of finish the process and wind up with this material that I knew, at some point an ancestor had created and felt themselves. It's like so visceral and so emotionally and spiritually, gratifying doesn't feel like the right word, but that's sort of what's kind of coming to mind right away. And I would really yeah, I'd really love to kind of, yeah, I don't know. Should we stick to our very structured question plan, or should we just kind of get into it?
I
Yeah,
was gonna say that it's kind of it's like a spiritual feeling that you're feeling, like you're feeling seen, you're feeling connected, you're feeling there's this part of you that you didn't quite know was like there, but you're it's like a door opening, and like all of a sudden these feelings come in and this connection, and like I'm not sure if it's a normal thing for other people, but it happens frequently for me, like if I'm around drumming or anything. So actually I used to be a jingle dress dancer. I mean, I still am. I'm just currently on a break. My dad and my grandpa passed away a couple of years ago, so they were my main ties to doing stuff like that. So it does get a little hard, like to try to go back to the circle, but knowing that the circle is always there for you is something really healing. It takes a part out. I mean, like you're always fighting with your brain, so you can always hold that fact that you have a spot in the circle when you're ready. But what I was gonna mention is that like whenever I'm around drumming and like just a lot of that energy, I feel tingly. Like it travels up my spine. I can feel it along my back, and it's just like a gentle touch. And it's like I don't know, like you know how somebody can just barely touch you and you feel that little bit of tingle. That's I feel that, and it kind of like emulates all over me, and then I'll feel it around my face, and it tickles and it makes me feel great.
right on. That's awesome. And like you're saying too, like the always to kind of know that place for ourselves in community is being held. That kind of ties into this community aspect of hide tanning, where, as Hayley and Kanina mentioned, like having people in community that hold this knowledge that are willing to share was a really big part of your learning. And maybe Allan, you've been a massive part of me kind of becoming closer to tanning as our ancestors would have done it, or feeling more of that kind of, yeah, I think like a close connection to that maybe. And maybe Allan, if you wouldn't mind speaking a bit to sort of like the spiritual and emotional piece that comes along with tanning, I think that'd be great, because I think that's something that I think I hear that quite a bit across all of our experiences with it. I'd really love to hear a bit of what you'd like to share around that piece.
Yeah, I'm happy to share that piece. So I am Stamia, a two-spirited person, Indigiqueer. And I was quite close with my grandmother, and we spent 20 years. My grandmother attended the Kamloops Indian Residential School, as did my mom, as did several of my aunts and uncles, my grandfather. And part of my story of growing up as a young two-spirit femme person, was that feeling of like a lot of homophobia and transphobia that existed within our communities, that was introduced through Catholicism and all of these white policies that attacked gender. And I remember having this conversation that started out like, so it's connected to both my story of reconnecting to who I am as a two-spirited person, and how the Nlaka'pamux people and the Syilx people actually acknowledge more than two genders. So the Nlaka'pamux we call our Shmutlacheza, and the Syilx is Stamia. And it started out, as a conversation with my grandparents around like, well, were there people like me? And digging through all of the pieces around colonialism and introduced patriarchy and stuff. And it's a really long story, but I can boil it down that it took 20 years for us to be able to start to do that work of reclaiming what those roles were. And a lot of it was attached to craft, like a lot of hide tanning, and hide fixing was in the realm of femmes in our community, right? And part of that piece being is that it was the main economy of our people, right? Like men, our masked folks, the hunters would get the animal, but it was always the women of the community and the matriarchs that would go out and get it. And that was also always inclusive of Indigiqueer two-spirit people, right? So you would go and get that animal, you would bring it home, you would dress it, you would work on the hides. And so thus it became part of your economy, and so it was like a lot of femmes were the ones that held wealth within the community. They were the ones that distributed meat to families and to community members that needed it. And that was just a really respected and held space that the fur trade came and disrupted that, right? It started to disrupt and change those systems. So that's part of the story. But, in gendered terms, like I wasn't like the other boys, so I was often with my grandma, and so my grandmother would get me to help her, and she'd get me to help her with her soaking and with her scraping and with her stretching and with her tanning. And it would always be piecemeal, right? Like I always did little pieces here and there with her, but I was always involved with her ever since I was really small. And growing up, like I had never actually had the experience because as a young queer person who is experiencing a lot of homophobia and transphobia within community, like the story of many of us, we end up leaving community, and we move into larger urban centers where we can connect to community. And so, like I was down there and we kept talking. I always had this goal where I was just like, I just want to work on a hide from start to finish. And we kept talking about that. And we kept making these plans, but, my relationship with partying and substance use had changed, and I was partying a lot and I work a lot in harm reduction. I worked in the downtown east side for a decade and a bit now. And now I'm working in language, but part of that whole story was, I started to carry shame about where I was at. And so I wouldn't come home as often. And my grandmother was such a gentle, loving person, I was her one, but I kept saying, we're okay, so we're going to do it. And then the year that she passed was the year we had all of these plans to come and we were just going to work on a hide. And unfortunately, she passed away in 2016. And that was a huge piece. Like we were incredibly close. And that was a huge piece of my grieving was like, we didn't do this thing. And I was like, I felt so bad and I felt so grief stricken for that. And a relative of mine reminded me, it's just like, like when we lose our grandmothers, our mothers, like our grandfathers, like we lose the physical relationship, but what it turns into is a spiritual relationship. And my grandmother always told me, she always said this thing. She was like, you think you're not listening to me, but you are. And one day you're going to meet me. And I never understood what she was really meaning by that, and I was just like, okay. So the year that she passed, somebody had brought 2 deer for her feast and we had the hides. And I decided, I was like, you know what? Like, I might not have done this from start to finish with her, but I've done enough pieces that I'm going to figure this out. And so I started, and I had an uncle that was there that had worked with her before, and he gave me some of the tools in which to do it. And so I spent the entire summer working on this one hide, from soaking it to scraping it, stretching it, braining it, which we all know is like such an intense experience with it, because if it doesn't work, you got to do it again. You got to find more brain. You got to, and each of these times I would do it, like I would have these moments where I would just break down, like I would be in tears on the ground, just feeling so bad that I hadn't listened, and I'd have my release. And then all of a sudden, like a breeze would come and I'd hear a little voice inside my head that say, okay, you got to soak it again. And so I'd like take some deep breaths and then I'd soak it again. And then when I'd be stretching or tanning it, I would be like, what am I doing? And I'd hear something. I'd feel something touch my shoulder. And I'm doing this all by myself in the same little gully that my mom and my grandma and my aunts had all done it in. And I'd feel something touch my shoulder and I'd hear a voice just say, don't poke so hard, And so I just kept doing this. And it was such a long process. And my grandfather, like he and I hadn't been particularly close until after my grandmother passed. And when the whole thing, and then smoking it as well, like I was like, so I started from start to finish this whole process. And when I finally put the finished project or finished hide in front of him at the kitchen table, it was just the two of us. And he sat there And he wasn't really much of a talker with me, but he sat there and he touched the entire hide from one corner. He just rubbed it and he would go all about it. And he sat there for almost 20 minutes with this hide, and I didn't say anything and he didn't say anything. And then finally at the end, he just sat back and he looked at it and he said, "This is a really good hide." He's like, "Your grandma would be so proud of you. This is like your grandma's hide." And I was just like, "Woo." But it was like that beautiful piece of, like it was part of my grieving process. Like the whole summer, of working on this hide and like getting my frustrations out, because I wasn't just grieving the loss of my grandmother. I was grieving like disconnection from community. I was grieving, like my relationship with substance. And like I've stopped using that. Like after in 2016, I stopped partying. I was like, I'm going to do a traditional grieving for a year. And then after that, I was like, I'm not going to go back to it. But that's been a really big piece of healing for me, was working on this hide, and along the way, just asking questions of people that might have remembered. And I think also with my aunties, like a lot of them had also, we get caught up in our lives, right? Like we've got some of us that have kids and we have to take them to all these things, and people just kind of started to disconnect from it, but they also remember, and that's what I think my grandmother's words came through, is like, one day you're going to meet me. And that's what meeting her was working on this hide, because everything I thought, oh, I'm not listening, I didn't pay attention enough, I didn't write it down, I didn't make a video of it, it was stored in here, right? And so it lives here. And so that was the story of my first hide, as a point of connectivity, spirituality, and emotional healing. And now, like, I have hides in the city in my freezer, and working out little spaces in my yard to work on them with some of the aunties from there. And I really like Jacob's got a really cool setup in his house here. So it's really neat for me, because even though I'm in my mid 40s, like I don't claim to be like a knowledge keeper of it, right? Like I learn a lot from like our youth that are doing hide work, right? Like it's such like everything, like there's such innovations that happen. And I'm a person that always kind of believes, like as Indigenous people, like the things that are sacred and traditional for us aren't sacred and traditional because they live in this untouched place back here, that they cannot be changed. They're sacred because they're living. They're our relatives. We carry them into the future with us for the generations to come. And in some of my young relatives that live in the city, I've like introducing them to scraping, there's nothing like scraping a hide, getting all the goo and the fur off of it. Like, I'm just like, if you need a dopamine hit, like work on a hide. Like, when you complete it, you're going to get some dopamine in your brain. You're going to feel just good and sacred and connected. And you're going to have this beautiful thing that you can either turn into a drum, a rattle, or take it to the next step. So Huikwitsam, to tan a hide, Huikwitsam is a pretty special thing. So white.
Why, kiwa, Wikwitsam, catch. It really... You get a dopamine hit and your lats are going to be out of control as you're done the scraping. Yeah, I mean, holy smokes, there's
Talk about a whole body workout.
Straight up. So I think the one thing that I pulled out from there that I don't think we've had a chance to touch on yet, I guess it would be like the physicality and that kind of maybe like the physical and mental wellness piece. I know for myself, like Allan mentioned, the that sort of focus and that dopamine hit is very real, I guess. But that's, I think for me, like the physical aspect has been really, really huge. I find myself almost kind of, it's kind of found a place in my life similar to like going to the gym or something like that, just in like my kind of physical maintenance and making sure that my physical body is well enough that I can help with the hunt or dragging a deer or whatever it might be, that I know that I'm going to be well enough to, if I get a call from Uncle, if I get a call from Warren saying, "You want to hide?" I can just kind of jump up and go and be a part of getting that and kind of helping people out. And mentally, that's taking care of my physical body is a huge piece of my mental health and kind of being present. But maybe I know Kanina. I've only shaved one moose so far in my hide tanning journey. So it's whenever you share some Instagram stories of you just running through them, it's always kind of blows my mind. So if you wouldn't mind sharing a bit about the physical aspect of it, that would be really awesome.
Yeah, I'd say that like through hide tanning that I really got into the best shape that I feel like I'd ever been in. And it was like I was so appreciative of that aspect of hide tanning, and I didn't realize how much it was something that I wasn't looking for, and it just came, and I started to feel, thankful. I've always appreciated and admired strong women, but before hide tanning, that really wasn't how I would have like related myself to that. My family, we grew up. My dad is a canoer, and so he got into this area through doing canoe trips with his dad, and so he took his family out on like 2-3 week long canoe trips every summer. So I always feel like I had like strength from that. But I lived in Toronto for about 5 years in my early 20s. And then when I moved home, I shacked up and had a baby and then really just stopped doing physical things, like other than walking my son, going for walks. So I really didn't feel strong, right? Until I started hide tanning. And then I just started to feel so powerful in the things that I could do and the things that my body would do for me. And yeah, it's really awesome. Like a moose hide is so much work, and I've been tanning solo for a long time now. Like all the moose hides, like most of the moose hides I've scraped majority of them on my own. Sometimes I'll invite people over to work with me. Sometimes my dad will help. And I do most of my scraping in the winter when it's really cold. And that's another thing that I really love about it, is that it gets me outside in the cold, where I really wouldn't do that before. And I've been scraping this winter, and I'm kind of marvel at the work that I've done, because this year I have the help of a really nice boyfriend who's been scraping with me. And I'm amazed at how much scraping I've done on my own before that, because the scraping I have done this winter, I'm just like, how the hell did I do that? Because it feels so hard right now. Yeah, scraping this winter has felt a lot harder than it has for a while. And I'm even working out now. I'm going to workouts with my son. So I'm like, I should be getting stronger. Why does this feel so hard? So I really am just kind of impressed with myself in previous years and the things I was able to do on my own. And so thankful that I have someone who's, wanting to do these things with me, and now my son too. So it's really brought so much physicality into my life, that I love it so much for that.
That's so awesome. Couples that can't tan together stay together. I really love that. It's that I think what I heard a lot was sort of like that building of self-confidence, and kind of like that. I think tying it back to my own experience, kind of almost coming back to your body in a way that feels more natural than for myself. Like I never really got into sports and stuff like that growing up, so being able to kind of apply myself to something where if I didn't know it when I started, I found out really quick I had to get kind of had to get a bit of endurance built up. But I've got my stout Syilx legs to kind of prop me up really nice for scraping, and I've got longish arms to really reach down. But
it really makes me like talking about not doing sports or going to the gym, like that was something I was never into either. So I know I've talked on social media about like bush gym, but really connecting that to how our ancestors would have lived and the hard lives they would have had, right? And when I teach, I talk about this, about how, can you imagine before we could go get our clothes at the store, we had to do this. This was a practice we had to do to make clothing. And how we would have had to do it so often, because we would have just not been doing it just for ourselves, but for our entire, for our families, so we could clothe all of our kids and, grandkids and all of that. It's just amazing how much we would have done.
Totally. And I have I call him an elder, like my colleague Buckshot from a team that I work on, and he always reminds us, like, back in the day, like our ancestors were so much stronger than we could ever like imagine being, just by virtue of like you said, the daily activities, the necessities of life. Like, even, you see a lot of people kind of clowning around on Facebook. Some kind of truck hunters might talk about berry pickers, but see, when push comes to shove, that's the amount of knowledge on the land and hiking that you have to do just to get your optimal spot is, it's the perspective. Yeah, I just really love kind of thinking about our traditional activities in that way. And I also just want to do a quick check for time. I knew this would happen, but I didn't know it would happen quite so quickly. But we're coming up at 10 to 1. Does everybody feel okay about sticking around a bit past time, or I could also kind of expedite my facility? Yeah, right on. If anybody has any kind of like hard outs, or just like they really need to step away, that's totally fine. Yeah, awesome. Sorry about that.
Well, good. There's an interesting one, Jago. I just wanted to touch, like, that piece again to what Kanina was saying.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny, because as Indigenous folks, we're jokers. We like to joke around, and also like that whole like berry picker hunter thing. It's like most of the ones that are like doing the hunting, they're not tanning hides. And that's really hard work. But also it's an important piece, I think, for us to like reframe that too. Like berry picking is just as important as hunting. Like root digging is just as important, right? Like all of these things surpass gender norms and expectations, right? So it's such a, but I get a kick out of that, because it's like you get in really good shape when you're like
Oh, exactly. I mean, even just like you meet like these little old ladies up north, where like Kanina said, like where that's still like a very active practice from previous generations, and they just look like you cook them. But holy smokes, like they could knock me out. Like just the amount of like, grip strength, lat strength, that functional strength that would really get, it's never mess around, Awesome. And then, I mean, I've been taking little notes as we've been talking. So I remembered some things I'd like to call back to, and I'm kind of getting a little bit overwhelmed, but I know, I would really love to call on Hayley a bit, just to kind of tie us back to the community piece, because I think that, like Allan mentioned, like we're learning from the young people that are kind of picking up this practice again. And like, they just made me think about Teresa talking about spoons. I remember we were chatting one day about tanning, and then one teaching that I've got, some teachings that a friend of mine shared from his grandma from the Bitterroot Syilx people, is that, we always scrape right up to the edge. We don't want to waste any hide. Then I was like, well, how the heck? I'm like looking at my tool, and it's just this big thing. And I was like, well, how the heck am I supposed to scrape the edge with this? And then here comes Teresa talking about the spoons that she got when she was a youth, and it's just things like that are, invaluable to us as we're kind of coming back to these practices. Yeah. Look at that form. And just thinking about that community piece, like Kanina and Hayley had both mentioned that we and myself, we found our way back to tanning, and Kanina was a huge part of me being able to feel as though that this is something that I could take on through the content that she shares through Cries Over Moose Hides and everything. And with all that being said, I know Hayley, you've been doing a lot of really amazing work with youth, with hide tanning as like a modality for wellness, and I really wanted to make sure to give you some space to talk about that project, because it sounds amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that like obviously like I live in the city, very like inner city, and Winnipeg has there's so many Indigenous people here. Like there's so many people from so many different communities here. Um and I work in kind of split, like I am a social worker and I work like in harm reduction here. And then I also run a program called Community Cousins for Two-Spirit youth in the city. And we run cultural programming and like cultural camps as a form of life promotion. So the point of that was like myself and my cousin Eli, we were tired of like, especially here in the city, like hearing about Indigenous people only in this negative light and only in this like risk factors, right? Like we were always hearing this, like you're at more risk because you're Indigenous. You're at more risk because you're Indigenous over and over and over again. And we really wanted to focus on like, well, what things like gave us strength, gave us healing, gave us life before. And all these things that we still have that we've always had that have kept us alive and that have kept us well. And so we really wanted to bring in hides as like a primary form of that, because like everyone has shared, like there's this huge spiritual connection, physical connection, emotional connection, and also that it's quite difficult sometimes to access these things in the city. A lot of times when there's hide camps, they're not here. They're outside of the city or they're in specific communities. And that is a huge barrier for people. If you don't have transportation, if you are using substances that you need to get through the day, it's not safe to leave the city. And a lot of people, I think from my community, like Peguis has had a lot of floods. So a lot of our band members are in the city because we were displaced from our reserve, a reserve that we were already displaced and sent to. So my band has a ton of people that live in the city here. And it's almost like, you're disconnected from community, but when your parents, your grandparents, when they also have been disconnected from community, there's not always like a family to go back to. There's not always someone's house on the res to go stay at if you want to visit. That's not always an option. So like I said, I started asking my uncles that do hunt for hides. And my uncle gave me a deer. And I brought it to lots of different places and set up frames for people to scrape. We had like people flesh it, all these different things in the city. And I found it interesting because like everybody wants to make drums and rattles, right? But a lot of times people have this really like visceral reaction to something that still has blood on it or hair on it. And that was something that we like did a lot of processing work on people. Like, what about this? Like, is making you feel unsettled? And like, how do we connect more with this hide as like a relative? Because it's reminding us that it's a relative, right? Like we have hair, we have blood, we have all these things. This is a living being or was a living being, and it's still something that has a spirit, that has, ancestors and teachings that we need to respect too. But yeah, I set up all these things. And like I said, like I don't really know what I'm doing all the time. And so there was like a lot of learning there too. But what I noticed was that people came out with these stories that I think a lot of times they didn't remember either until they were working on the hide, and they would share stories of, you know what, I actually remember watching my grandma do this, or I remember my auntie doing this. And I think for a lot of people, it unlocked like a piece of their 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 spirit and their memories that maybe they had hidden for safety, or that they like weren't able to access for whatever reason. Um, and then, yeah, when we did a culture count for community cousins this summer, we had an elk that we were working on, and mostly like stripping the hair. And it's still like I still have it. It's one that will continue to be worked on this summer. But we we all have so much grief, and I think particularly again like here, like a lot of us experience a lot of violence and a lot of like loss in our families, our communities, whatever. Um, and so while we were like stripping the hair, slipping the hair, um, we talked about like how like we can ask like that elk to take some of that grief from us too. Like as we're working on it and putting in so much labor and so much like attention and care, and we're singing to it a lot of times too, right? Like we're praying, we're singing, we are like interacting with this relative, and we can leave stuff with it too, because it can handle some of the things that we can't, right? And I think that was again, and like Teresa's talking about, like I feel those tingles, right? Like talking about this, and like for me too, like it's been so healing to see like my my family work on these hides. And like we come from a family that has been very disconnected and very impacted by like schools and drugs and all of these sort of things. And like to see my family, like to see my cousins doing that, like makes me so proud and so hopeful for our family, but like for our community in the city, our community on the res, like our community of like two-spirit people here. Um, and I think like, yeah, it's something that for us shows that we can like heal in community, um, and that like the hides are part of that community. Yeah.
Gee whiz. That way. Oh, that's so amazing. I mean, there's just like when everybody's been speaking in our gathering today, there's just so much, and I think I really really love the way that memory has been coming up for everybody during this talk. Like Hayley mentioned, just that's something that I've been noticing as well, as I kind of find myself in spaces with people where it's a group from just a wide array of experience, and the way that memory comes up for folks is so striking. It's really I think Teresa at the Chew hunt camp, the way that Elder Sharon was able to talk to the one participant and really help him draw out memories of his grandmother, kind of going through their family's specific practices around tanning, was really amazing. And like Kanina, discovering your own family's connection to tanning previously, right? And I think that's just something that's been just like, yeah, I think that's just something that I wanted to kind of pick up a bit that's been coming up throughout our talk today. That's really beautiful, and something that I think that I think it's regardless of your own personal connection, I think that your memory of your ancestors and your community always comes through in a practice like this, which really really kind of points towards like the spiritual wellness aspect. Is something that it's something that's still kind of difficult for me to talk about, just as someone that didn't grow up very culturally. Is sort of how do I talk about this animal as a relative of mine without kind of uh, without thinking I sound somehow, you know what I mean? Like it's just kind of like really opening myself up to experiences like that. And tanning has been a really huge part of that. You know, it's, you can't help but kind of marvel at the strength of the animal. And, you know, it really kind of ties everything together to become really involved in a traditional practice like that.
Well, and it really connects to that healing aspect, because you don't start feeling that until you sit down and you really think about, like, what am I running from? What is making me uncomfortable? Why am I trying to not do this right now? So it bridges the gap between, like, how you are in a Western world and then how you are in a healed, coming from a place of love, not thinking negatively about yourself, being humble, I guess, is what I'm really trying to say. Is like, do you feel comfortable enough with yourself to sit there and call yourself out? Because you can sit there and you can have other people be like, you need to do this and you need to fix this and you need to, but that doesn't always sink in the way it should. Like, you know, you can tell somebody to do something, but that doesn't mean they're going to listen and do it because they're not ready. So healing is a really big aspect, and it's really good. And I'm starting to ramble. But I believe it ties in with being humble, because then, I mean, I've always been around hides. I knew they stink, but like I didn't really think about how they stank until like my dad had to come and do a workshop at my school. And you know, I was one of 2 Native kids in the whole class, and so when I was able to be like, my dad's coming to do like drums with us, I was excited, and they were excited because, you know, they were all excited to make drums and stuff. But they their thoughts were different as soon as they started making it.
That's such a really important one too, because like the stink, you know, it really kind of like it teaches the discipline, right? Because like you can still work on a hide that's smelly that you might have been like, oh, I can do it tomorrow, you know, but you still have to do that work. So it's like the sooner you do it, like the less the like it's going to change the experience of it, right? So that's the thing that I've learned. It's just like, oh yeah, when I'm doing this, I got to like actually do it, you know, because I still have to do this work. It's just going to look a lot different, you know, if I don't prioritize.
I always remember like going into the bathroom and like my dad would be getting a hide ready in the tub, and I didn't know. I mean, I kind of knew, like I could smell the smell lingering around the house, and then I would go into the bathroom, open the door, and the smell would just like hit me like a wall, and I'm like, oh, it's hide tanning day. And then I was like, I remember, you know, when I was being a teenager and still sassy and everything, and I'm like, oh, Dad, that smells so bad, and he's like, it smells so good. And I remember being like, oh my God, you know, whatever. But as I got older, it's like, you know, actually it's not too bad.
Oh yeah. I think we all appreciate the tanner's cologne, as it were, in the vintages. I know in the in the promotion for this, I had mentioned maybe some gross stories, but that was just mine. But you know, related to what Allan said, you know, it's talk about your mental wellness. Part of that is being like present and being accounting of all of the different projects and pieces that you're being entrusted with. And mine was losing track of an extra hide that we had. Kind of, you know, like bless this fellow, like he dropped it off like right after he got it. He knuckled it. It was a beautiful hide, and I just happened to forget it for a couple seasons. I was just getting caught up in like, you know, it was certainly in a different stage when I found it and remembered what was in that bag. It was still workable though. We did it, but it was just, it was definitely a lesson, and I'm glad that I followed through and took care of our relative. Really, like, it's as funny as it is to talk about getting a hide that's really gorgeous and like red, and then opening it up nigh on 8 months and a hot season later and discovering that it's now green and a little bit purple. it's
Was that the one with a little bit of flesh on it?
There were yeah. But the hair slipped really well, so that's good. But I think that kind of, speaking about that, like, prioritization in our life, you know what I mean, and like the way that ties back to to what Hayley is talking about too, in terms of the way that we think about our urban relatives or our relatives that are going through different struggles and like that. I think that harm reduction piece can become a really powerful part in our thinking, and the way that we're kind of reconnecting to these practices. If that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. It because you get so lost or you can get lost in your addiction and everything, because that's what's around us. That's what we see every day. We see ads for this drink. We see ads for like going out with friends and everything. So it ties into those habits that aren't necessarily that weren't ours. They're not made for us. They were habits that were instilled and pushed on us, and that's not really who we are. So when we get lost in the world around us and not remembering where we come from and our roots, it becomes more healing. You find yourself, and I really think that's what Hayley did there, and what she's continuously doing is she's helping people reconnect with their roots and making a safe space for them. We listen and we don't judge. So you need those spaces.
Totally. And I think that I'm thinking a lot about Allan's experience as well, as we're kind of talking about those spaces and the way that we relate to one another. I think that, how do I describe this? Like that kind of instinct to back away from our relatives and from our traditions as we might be kind of figuring things out, or and whether or not it's inherently unhealthy, if we find ourselves negotiating our relationship to our relatives and our traditions and to substances and our friends or something like that. And I think that something like hide tanning really creates an opportunity for everybody involved, like friends and family, to kind of, whether that is just something to come home to do, to come home to help tan a hide, but also maybe for someone that might have, you can have as many, kind of thoughts or opinions about substance use as you like, but at the end of the day, having an extra pair of hands to scrape a hide is pretty nice. But I think that something like this really creates opportunities in community for people to gather. And maybe I'll do another time check now. We're kind of coming up on 1:45. Maybe if anybody has, like, maybe we could kind of open it up for some closing reflections if it feels natural to do that, or we could keep on rapping, freestyling as it were. But I do want to be conscientious of everybody's day, as I know Allan's got some birthday parties to hit.
7-year-old birthday parties, they're the thing.
Yeah. Right on. But yeah, maybe if we want to take some time for some closing reflections from folks, that would be I think that'd be awesome. We have a couple questions to answer, just a couple. There's some really cool feedback from the participants here today as well. I'd really love to highlight. And then we've got our giveaway. We can give away. Heck yeah. But like I said before, if anybody has any obligations or has to head out, that's totally fine. We're, like I said, we're over time. But yeah, maybe if anybody would like to has anything they'd like to share before we go, that'd be yeah.
I just really want to hold up the other panelists. Kanina, huge fan, follow you on the gram. I think I've actually even done one of your online courses before. And Hayley, yeah, like I'm such a, like I will fan they over anyone doing urban work with hides. Like there's like, it's such an amazing piece. I love that a lot of our youth and folks are reconnecting our people in that way. I'm a firm believer in that our like, especially around our hides, like these are just my thoughts, there is space for people who are using substances to be in our communities. You don't have to be drug free to be cultural, right? And I think that's one of the amazing gifts when we were using hides in the work in the downtown east side, with a lot of our aunties and uncles and relatives who are there, was the amount of knowledge that's held by people who use drugs in the city, whose knowledge sometimes is overlooked because they're seen as deficient or whatever else. And so that's such an important space that to bring folks in, right? And yeah, I think that's a really beautiful piece of work. And so I'm a big fan, and I look forward to connecting some more about this and on this with y'all.
I think the word trauma has come up a lot, and I really liked what Hayley said about just, asking or for that, the animal to take that trauma from us. And I never really put it in that view before, but I feel like it's such a common grief, like working through grief with hide work has been such a common thing. I've heard from, definitely an experience for myself, but my friends have talked about the way, like how powerful it is as a tool for navigating grief and trauma. I really liked, Hayley, just thank you for sharing it that way. It's really neat. And thanks to everyone nice to meet you, West Coasters. If you're on the coast, I actually don't know where that is, but out west.
Oh, I'm sure it's mutual. I mean, I don't know. It's kind of the deserty up here, I guess. But after the Coquihalla, it actually gets dry enough that hide work becomes feasible. I think if you're going to get into Vancouver and the Lower Mainland, the dampness might be an obstacle. Is that true in your experience? Yeah. Okay. Oh, look at me.
I think that's such an important thing to recognize, is just how different hide work is based all over, like where I live. And I've been such a blabber. I talk so much about frost scraping is because I know that's how people worked on hides. I've heard numerous people talk about that, but like that would never work for people in warmer climates or where we don't get minus 15 Celsius, right? Like that's not how you would have worked on hides. Like but we all did it, we all did it. So it's so cool.
So desperately jealous of the frost scraping. We were able to do it last winter because it got to be negative 30 here for like a couple weeks, but this winter was so warm. We were just just looking at the weather report every single morning, being like, come on.
I'm still frost scraping. I'm going to go rack a deer hide after this and scrape it tomorrow morning.
That's awesome. Right on.
I'm really like stoked to meet all of you. I follow Kanina too, so I was like, oh my god. So yeah, it's really exciting just to hear like other people's perspectives, I think too, and especially like those of you that like seen like work in your families. That's really like something I hope like for the future of like my family, that's something like next generations will have. And I think my other like thought is just like I think sometimes there's a lot of pressure to have like the perfect like tools or like technique or like I remember like when I first did a deer and I was so excited. Like I was so stoked and I showed an elder and he was kind of like, he just like he was like, well, you're supposed to use like, you know, like traditional like bone tools. And I was like, well, do you have them? Because I don't have them. And I don't have like, you know, I don't have access to those. And until I meet someone who does, like to me, it's better that I use what I have. And maybe that's a knife or some like gross piece of metal that I sharpened up, but that's what I have. And to me, it's better that I do it with those than wait and continue to like lose opportunities because I don't have these like traditional tools or whatever. And I, you know, and forgiveness because I've cut myself, I've messed up hides like so badly, and like to me, it's like I have to know that like my intentions are known, you know, like it's okay, and I'm trying, and maybe one day that won't happen, but right now it is, but I'm learning and that's okay. And I think like people get nervous to work on hides and like different animals because they don't want to make a mistake. But I think to me, like it's better that you do it and make a mistake than don't do it at all.
And hides are so forgiving, you know?
Yep, exactly. I was just about to say the same thing too. And that's probably something I learned from Kanina.
But it's my dad who's pointed that out to me.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, even like, I think I was probably sending you a bunch of messages about this particular hide Amanda and I had been kind of chipping away at for the better part of a year. That just, you know, I think it was just past the point where it really wanted to become like a nice leather, but you know, we're still able to use it for moccasin soles, for just more functional pieces, right? Like this. Yeah. No, I think that's such an important and really awesome piece to kind of hold as you're starting your journey, or even as you continue, you know, like every hide is different. Every day's weather is different. You know, you're not going to come out with like a uniform piece of commercial hide every time you sit down to do it. And I think just that piece of like, use what you have, keep on learning, and trust the process. And just kind of continue to learn, you know. It's better to make a mistake and have attempted to do your best than to just not have worked on anything at all. And you know, maybe we can close with our thoughts from Teresa.
I'm sorry, I heard you briefly mention my name, but my audio is being funky.
Well, that's all good. I was just wondering if you had any closing thoughts or just anything just anything you'd like to share before we kind of wrap it up, as it were.
Not too much. It's just really nice to like meet with like a similar group. It is nice to have like kind of a mix of like both, having people who've been here for a little bit and then having people who are picking it up and loving it, and it feels just as much as part of them as breathing already. And like I think it's beautiful that it's such a deep part of yourself and you're finding it, and I love it.
Awesome. That's so, thank you so much. That's so, yeah, you know, and then, you know, just as Allan said, you know, I just really want to take a moment before we wrap up just to say thank you on behalf, like for myself and on behalf of the rest of the Indigenous Youth Wellness team, everybody for coming and being so, you know, vulnerable and genuine in your reflections. And you know, these can be really difficult things to talk about. And, you know, I really appreciate the trust, you know, and I'm just so happy that everybody was able to make it today. And I think that there's just so much that we've talked about that, you know, just like new ways for me to kind of think about my own practice and kind of new ways to articulate just the amount of value that our relatives bring into our life, and the way that our ancestors are kind of resonating through these practices. So I think we did it. Right on.